Before the headlines, before the scandal, Manohara Odelia Pino lived in a world most people only saw in magazines. Born in 1992 in Jakarta to Daisy Faharina, a glamorous and headstrong Indonesian woman of Bugis royal lineage, and Ruben Pino, a cultured French businessman, her life straddled two worlds, Eastern tradition and Western sophistication. Manohara's childhood was an aesthetic blend of European boarding schools and Jakarta's elite circles. But even amid the luxury, there were quiet storms. Her parents' marriage had collapsed early, leaving Daisy to raise Manohara mostly on her own. Ruben eventually vanished from their daily life, and Daisy, fiercely protective and ambitious, stepped into the role of both mother and architect of her daughter's future. Manohara was her everything, the golden child with porcelain skin, wide eyes, and a grace that drew attention without trying. As she entered her teens, modeling agencies took notice. Her photos began to circulate in high society. Whispers started, "She's going to be something big." But no one, least of all Manohara, could have predicted that her name would one day shake two nations. The moment Manohara met Tengku Muhammad Fakhri Petra in 2006 felt like something out of a movie. She was just 14, a teenager barely beginning to understand the world, and he was a dashing figure from an entirely different universe, royalty. A prince from the Malaysian state of Kelantan, Tengku Fakhri wasn't just wealthy, he wielded influence wrapped in centuries-old protocol and power. Their meeting took place during a formal diplomatic event in Kuala Lumpur. Manohara was there as part of the entourage of dignitaries and Jakarta elites her mother had long orbited. Fakhri noticed her instantly. She was young, elegant, and clearly enchanted by the setting. He was confident, polished, and used to being obeyed. Soon, he was calling her directly, sending her lavish gifts, inviting her to royal banquets. Daisy, thrilled by the connection, encouraged the attention. From her perspective, the prince wasn't just a suitor, he was security. A royal match could elevate her daughter's future and solidify her own legacy. But there was an unspoken discomfort in Manohara's smile. She was still a girl, navigating first crushes, not courtship with an adult prince. But the pageantry and power were overwhelming. And saying no to royalty? That wasn't really an option. The months that followed were a whirlwind of curated romance and quiet unease. Prince Fakhri continued his pursuit, flying Manohara and Daisy to Malaysia on private jets, whisking them away to royal functions, and draping them in luxury. He knew how to dazzle. There were silk gowns for Manohara, exclusive access to palace rooms, and candlelit dinners under guarded verandas. But there were red flags, moments where the prince's charm cracked. Once, after Manohara laughed a little too long at a joke from another man, he snapped, accusing her of disrespect. Another time, he grew cold when she hesitated before accepting one of his gifts. There was an air of control beneath his compliments. Still, Daisy remained optimistic. In her eyes, these were minor flaws, correctable, excusable even, for a man of power. The pressure grew. More formal meetings with Fakhri's family were arranged. Expectations became clearer. This wasn't casual. This was leading to marriage. Manohara, now 15, seemed caught between curiosity and dread. She confided little to her mother. The palace made her nervous, she admitted once, but Daisy dismissed it. What girl wouldn't be overwhelmed by royalty? Behind the royal smiles, Manohara's autonomy was already slipping away. In August 2008, with disturbing swiftness, the wedding was announced. Manohara was 16, barely old enough to drive in most countries, and the ceremony was scheduled in Kota Baru, Kelantan's capital. Daisy hesitated. She asked questions, tried to delay, demanded more time. But the palace pushed back. Royal custom, religious pressure, and political maneuvering were suddenly at play. Behind closed doors, there were veiled warnings. Suggestions that backing out could damage reputations, that the prince had sacrificed pride and tradition for this match, and that to walk away now would bring shame. Daisy, though afraid, eventually conceded. The wedding itself was extravagant. Gold embroidery, religious rituals, state officials in attendance. Manohara wore traditional Malay bridal attire, her face masked behind layers of ceremonial makeup. To the cameras, she was a radiant young bride stepping into her destiny. But her eyes told another story. She looked lost, distant, as if she had floated above her body just to survive the day. That night, after the festivities faded and the palace doors closed, the first night of her new life began. Not with love, but with fear. Behind that royal suite door, the man who had promised her the world would begin to unravel it. The reality of royal life hit like a thunderclap. The prince, once charming and composed, revealed his darker nature. There was no honeymoon bliss, only strict rules, enforced silence, and suffocating control. Manohara, still reeling from the ceremony, found herself confined to the palace, her movements monitored and her voice muted. The first signs of abuse were subtle, a harsh word here, a bruised wrist there. Then came the accusations. Fakhri believed she disrespected him, that she didn't behave like a proper princess. He scrutinized her every action. Manohara was forbidden from using her phone freely, denied access to her mother, and subjected to humiliating dress codes. She was no longer a bride, she was property. When Daisy visited weeks later, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Manohara barely made eye contact. She seemed thinner, more reserved, and constantly glancing toward the shadows as if someone were always watching. When Daisy confronted the prince, he dismissed her, his tone condescending, even mocking. He insisted everything was fine, that Manohara was adjusting to royal life. But Daisy knew. Her daughter was terrified, and she was now deep inside a kingdom that played by its own rules, one where women like Manohara had no power and no way out. Manohara's life inside the Kelantan palace quickly became a gilded nightmare. On the outside, she was the picture of royal elegance, a teenage princess in embroidered kabayas, seated beside her husband at public functions, waving gently to crowds who admired her grace. But behind the palace gates, she lived in near total isolation. Her passport had been confiscated, her phone monitored or taken. She could no longer speak freely to her friends, and calls to her mother were brief and scripted, always under watch. The palace was sprawling and luxurious, but it was also guarded and impenetrable. Armed personnel patrolled the grounds. Surveillance was constant. If she spoke out of turn, there were consequences. Slaps, threats, punishments that chipped away at her identity. At night, she cried quietly into silk pillows, wondering how she had gone from teenage dreamer to royal prisoner. Fakhri was no longer a suitor, he was her captor, obsessed with dominance and appearances. He demanded loyalty, submission, and silence, and when she tried to resist, even subtly, his punishments became more personal and more degrading. He would remind her often, she belonged to him now. The palace might have had marble floors and chandeliers, but to Manohara, it was a cage lined with gold. Thousands of miles away, Daisy Fatarina's maternal instincts screamed louder with every unanswered call. When Manohara did manage to speak to her, her voice was dulled, almost robotic. She would say things like, "Everything is fine, Mama, don't worry." But Daisy knew her child's voice too well to believe the lie. She flew to Malaysia several times, requesting meetings with the prince and the palace officials. Each time, she was met with cold politeness or outright hostility. When she demanded to see her daughter privately, she was refused. At one point, the palace suggested that Daisy was interfering with the marriage and that she should leave Manohara to adjust. Daisy wasn't just worried, she was terrified. The media had begun whispering about tension inside the Kelantan palace, but no one had concrete proof. And in a society where royal affairs were protected by layers of tradition and state power, Daisy felt powerless. Still, she pressed on, contacting embassies, lawyers, even speaking to journalists in secret. She knew something was very wrong, but her access was limited. She was a mother screaming from the outside of a fortress while her daughter disappeared further into its shadows. And with each passing day, Daisy feared she might never get her child back. The abuse escalated, and this time there were marks that couldn't be hidden. One night, after an argument over Manohara's refusal to participate in a private event for the prince's friends, Fakhri exploded. What began as a shouting match turned violent. He struck her across the face, hard enough to leave a bruise. Then he locked her inside their quarters for 2 days, denying her food, access to medical help, or even light. When she was finally let out, a palace nurse offered ice and quiet condolences, but no one dared intervene. Manohara's body bore the evidence: bruises on her arms, a swollen lip, scratches on her wrists from struggling. And worse, she knew she couldn't speak out, not just because she feared more violence, but because the palace had built a narrative around her, that she was a royal bride living in splendor. To tell the truth would be to betray that illusion, and in this kingdom, betrayal was dangerous. Fakhri often reminded her of what she stood to lose. If you shame me, your family will suffer. You will be disgraced. No one will believe you. The emotional abuse twisted around the physical. Manohara began to wonder if there really was no escape. She was now 17, her youth draining away behind palace curtains stained with secrets. And outside, the world had no idea what was happening to the girl they once called a princess. Manohara's existence inside the palace had become a cycle of fear, obedience, and despair. Her days were rigidly scheduled, with carefully curated public appearances where she smiled on cue, dressed in immaculate designer clothing, her makeup concealing both bruises and pain. But beneath the silk and ceremony, her spirit was breaking. The emotional manipulation Fakhri inflicted was relentless. He would alternate between cruel punishments and lavish gifts, telling her she was both his beloved and his possession. He threatened her constantly, warning that any attempt to escape or embarrass him would be met with retaliation, not just against her, but against her mother. Manohara began cutting herself, tiny marks hidden beneath her sleeves. It was the only form of control she had left over her body. Her cries for help were muffled in the echo chamber of the palace's gilded silence. Staff members looked the other way. Government officials remained mute. The royal family's reputation was paramount, and the cost of truth was far too high. She prayed each night for some kind of rescue, unsure if anyone even remembered she was still alive. In early 2009, Manohara's health had deteriorated to the point where she could barely keep food down. She began suffering from panic attacks and dizzy spells. Daisy, growing desperate, made one final plea to the Malaysian courts for access to her daughter, but was swiftly denied. Then came a rare opportunity. The Kelantan royal family planned a diplomatic trip to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and Manohara would be part of the delegation. It was the first time in months that she would be outside of Malaysia, outside the walls of the palace. Manohara knew this might be her only shot at freedom. In secret, she begged a U.S. embassy worker in Jeddah for help. At first, they were hesitant, confused by the gravity of her request. But then she showed them her injuries, fresh welts and fading bruises on her back, evidence of repeated abuse. With trembling hands, she whispered her story. She begged for asylum, for safety, for someone, anyone, to believe her. The embassy arranged for a meeting with her mother, who had been waiting in Singapore. A daring, high-risk plan was put in motion. They would get her out during the diplomatic stopover. There was no guarantee it would work. If caught, the consequences would be catastrophic. The escape happened in the early hours of April 19, 2009. Manohara slipped away from the royal entourage with help from American officials and fled into the protection of the U.S. Embassy in Jeddah. The news sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Daisy met her daughter soon after, collapsing into tears upon seeing how frail, how scared she looked. Manohara had lost weight, her eyes sunken from stress and trauma. She could barely speak at first, only cry and hold on to her mother. But soon, she began to open up, recounting the physical and psychological torment she had endured at the hands of Fakhri. The press caught wind of the story, and almost overnight, Manohara went from royal enigma to international headline. The image of her as the beautiful, obedient princess was replaced by something far more human and tragic. That of a young woman who had been systematically abused and silenced by power. Back in Malaysia, Fakhri denied everything. The royal family dismissed her claims as lies. But in Indonesia, she was hailed as brave, a survivor who had risked everything to tell the truth. After her escape, Manohara and Daisy held a press conference in Jakarta that riveted the nation. Cameras flashed as the 17-year-old stood beside her mother, eyes filled with both fear and determination. Her voice was quiet but steady. She described in chilling detail how she had been physically assaulted, how her movements were monitored, how she had been psychologically broken by the man she once believed cared for her. Daisy, too, spoke out, furiously calling for legal action against Fakhri, denouncing the Malaysian government's inaction, and demanding justice for her daughter. But the case wasn't easy. Malaysia refused to cooperate. They claimed there was no abuse. Some officials even accused Daisy of brainwashing her daughter for publicity. And yet, public opinion, at least in Indonesia, was firmly with Manohara. Women's rights groups rallied behind her. Survivors of abuse sent letters of support. She began appearing on talk shows and in interviews, her voice growing louder with each retelling of her ordeal. Though still traumatized, she had done what few dared. She had stood up to a prince. She had run from royalty, not into obscurity, but into light. And her story had only just begun. Manohara's escape had ignited a diplomatic firestorm between Malaysia and Indonesia. The media couldn't get enough of the story. A stunning teen bride, a Malaysian prince, a daring escape, and explosive abuse allegations. While Indonesia rallied behind Manohara as a symbol of courage, Malaysia recoiled. The Kelantan royal family publicly dismissed her claims as fiction. Fakhri himself, wrapped in privilege and arrogance, claimed she was mentally unstable and ungrateful. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting on the Malaysian government to silence the scandal. Officials warned Daisy and Manohara that they were pushing boundaries by going public with details. But they refused to be silenced again. What had happened wasn't a family matter. It was a human rights crisis. Manohara gave more interviews, describing in painstaking detail the abuse she endured, how Fakhri once burned her with a cigar when she tried to speak up, how he drugged her during long international flights to keep her sedated, and how she lived every day under the threat of being disappeared. She didn't cry when she spoke. She looked directly into the camera. Her truth, raw and unwavering, was becoming impossible to ignore, even for those who wished to forget her. Fakhri didn't take humiliation lightly. Enraged by the growing sympathy for Manohara, he filed legal action against her in Malaysia for defamation and breach of contract, claims that, under Islamic marriage law, could have serious repercussions. He demanded she return to Malaysia to face the court. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If she returned, she could be detained or worse, forced back into royal custody. Manohara's legal team refused, stating that she would not set foot in Malaysia again until her safety could be guaranteed, and an international court heard her case. The prince's retaliation didn't stop there. He began attacking Daisy publicly, accusing her of orchestrating the entire scandal for attention and money. Meanwhile, back in Indonesia, rumors circulated that powerful Malaysian figures were trying to blacklist Manohara from the entertainment and modeling industry to damage her future prospects. Daisy received anonymous threats. Private investigators followed them. Still, the mother and daughter refused to be broken. They hired bodyguards. They went to human rights organizations. They understood now. They weren't just fighting a prince. They were fighting a system, and that system wanted them erased. As the dust began to settle, Manohara tried to reclaim her life in Jakarta. But healing wasn't easy. At just 17, she had survived not only abuse, but a political and media circus. She had no privacy, no sense of normalcy. She often experienced nightmares and panic attacks. Trust was a fragile thing, but her mother remained her anchor. Daisy encouraged her to speak, to stay visible. "If we disappear," she told her, "they win." Manohara began attending trauma therapy, started journaling, and began engaging with women's advocacy groups. She also returned to modeling, cautiously this time, choosing projects that reflected strength and identity. Producers reached out with offers for talk shows, even film roles, but she turned most of them down. She didn't want to be sensationalized. She wanted to be understood. Occasionally, when asked about Fakhri in interviews, she would pause, take a breath, and respond simply, "He no longer controls me." That sentence, short but powerful, became a mantra for many women following her journey. She wasn't just surviving, she was transforming. Despite all the noise from Fakhri's legal team, no criminal case against Manohara ever made it to trial. She never set foot in Malaysia again, and international pressure began to discourage any further pursuit of charges. It became clear that the Kelantan royal family wanted the story to quietly fade from public consciousness. In 2010, Fakhri quietly divorced Manohara through Islamic procedures without her presence or consent. There was no public announcement, just a brief legal notation in Malaysian records. He returned to his lavish life, protected by title and influence. For Manohara, it was an unceremonious end to a marriage that had cost her nearly everything. But she didn't grieve it. She breathed. She finally had her legal freedom. In a final act of symbolic closure, she changed her social media bio to a single sentence: "Still standing." It wasn't just a declaration, it was defiance. Though the system had tried to silence her, she had written her own ending, not as a royal, not as a victim, but as a survivor who fought her way back into the world. In the months and years that followed the media firestorm, Manohara Odelia Pinot found herself grappling with something far more complex than headlines or lawsuits. She was searching for her own identity in a world that had already tried to define her. The young woman once known to the world as a runaway princess or abused bride was far more than the roles assigned to her. Beneath the polished smile and composed interviews was someone deeply scarred, yet fiercely determined to write her own story. Jakarta, her hometown, had become both sanctuary and stage. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Women approached her with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of abuse and thanking her for the courage to speak. Men offered unsolicited advice or questioned her credibility, reminding her that society's scrutiny wasn't easily silenced. But Manohara wasn't seeking approval. She was seeking peace. She enrolled in language and art classes, quietly nurturing interests she'd never been allowed to pursue. In the past, everything she wore, said, or did was dictated by someone else, first by society's expectations, then by Fakhri's control. Now she began experimenting with painting, often using abstract imagery to represent her trauma. Streaks of red across black canvases, fragmented silhouettes of women, and eyes that watched silently from the corners. She didn't call herself an artist. She simply needed a release. For the first time, creativity became a form of therapy, one she didn't need permission to explore. Still, not all wounds healed gracefully. She often woke up disoriented, body tense, her breath shallow from dreams she couldn't explain. Sounds, like the sudden click of a door or the scent of men's cologne, could send her spiraling back into the corridors of the Kelantan Palace, reliving moments she had worked so hard to escape. Therapy helped, but the weight of her past lingered like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Publicly, she remained composed. But privately, Manohara began journaling about her experience with dissociation. Some days, she wrote, "I feel like I'm wearing my face. It looks like me, but it's not me." She described the emotional disconnection that came from years of survival mode. Slowly, she began reclaiming even the smallest pieces of autonomy, wearing jeans instead of tailored dresses, cutting her hair short against societal expectations, laughing loudly in public even when it felt strange. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were acts of reclamation. Despite her efforts to retreat into a quieter life, the media wasn't ready to let Manohara disappear. By 2012, several television networks began pitching dramatized documentaries and docuseries based on her story. Producers dangled promises of justice, fame, even a Hollywood adaptation. One American network reportedly offered a six-figure deal, but Manohara declined. "If my story becomes a spectacle," she said in an interview, "then I've lost control of it again." However, she understood the importance of staying visible. She had become a symbol, whether she liked it or not, so she decided to reframe the narrative on her own terms. Manohara accepted a role as a host for a women's empowerment talk show in Indonesia, one that featured stories of survival, resilience, and transformation. Her presence alone gave the show credibility. Viewers were captivated not by her fame, but by her sincerity. When she sat across from a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault, she didn't ask with pity. She asked with knowing. Each episode was emotionally charged. Some guests cried mid-interview, others hugged her off camera. "You make me feel seen," one guest whispered. That sentence stayed with Manohara long after filming ended. It was through this platform that she realized her voice wasn't just powerful, it was healing. She wasn't there to tell women what to do. She was there to show them what survival looked like on the other side of trauma. Unpolished, still bruised, but brave. Meanwhile, her social media following exploded. People from all over Southeast Asia, especially young women, flooded her inbox with messages of solidarity. Some confided that her story gave them the courage to leave abusive marriages. Others asked for help navigating legal systems. Manohara responded when she could, always careful to protect her own mental space, but her heart ached knowing how many were still trapped in silence. That same year, she was invited to speak at a regional women's rights summit. Standing before an international audience, she delivered a speech that left the room in stunned silence. She didn't dress in designer labels or deliver rehearsed lines. Instead, she read an excerpt from her journal, describing the moment she first realized her voice had been stolen, and the moment she chose to take it back. "I was 16 when I married a prince," she said. "I was 17 when I escaped a gilded prison. I was 18 when I realized no one was coming to save me, so I saved myself." But behind all the progress, a cruel irony haunted Manohara's story. There had never been any legal accountability for the crimes committed against her. Fakhri remained free, untouched by international law, his reputation dented but intact within Malaysia's elite circles. Despite repeated efforts by human rights lawyers, the absence of extradition treaties and the powerful influence of royalty ensured that justice would remain out of reach. Her mother, Daisy, had exhausted all legal avenues. From letters to the United Nations to meetings with legal NGOs in Geneva, she fought like a mother possessed. "He doesn't just owe us an apology," she once told the press. "He owes the world an explanation." But the world had moved on, as it often does. Scandals faded, news cycles churned. and a young woman's trauma was eventually reduced to a footnote in a timeline of royal controversy. Privately, Manohara made peace with the fact that Fakhri would likely never see a prison cell. "Justice," she wrote, "isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's surviving when they wanted you destroyed." Still, there were days when the unresolved nature of it all made her feel hollow. She avoided watching news about royalty or state functions. Seeing Fakhri's name, even in print, could ruin her entire week. Occasionally, Malaysian tabloids would publish old photographs, rehashing her story with sensational headlines like "The Princess Who Vanished" or "Royal Romance Turned Nightmare." She ignored them, but the public never quite let go of the fairy tale turned horror. In 2015, a controversial biographer attempted to write a tell-all book on Southeast Asian royal families, dedicating an entire chapter to Manohara's case. Without her consent, he described private moments, accused her of fabricating details, and painted her as a rebellious beauty who clashed with tradition. Manohara sued to stop publication. She won, but the damage was done. Once again, her trauma had been repackaged and sold. Tired but not defeated, she made a choice. She would never again allow her story to be told by someone else. If the world wanted to remember her, it would do so in her words, or not at all. By the time she turned 25, Manohara had transformed, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The teenager who had once been trapped in a palace, stripped of her will and voice, had become a woman who built her life piece by piece, brick by bruised brick. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a creator, a speaker, and, quietly, a healer. In a rare interview, she opened up about how she had found new strength in community work. She had started a discreet support initiative for young girls escaping forced marriages and abuse across Southeast Asia,